Hello, this is Thomas Wrightson's Author Talks, and in the grand tradition of writers everywhere, I've needed to throw something together at the last minute because what I was planning to do fell through. So for this episode, capping off Pride Month while also being in tune with the UK-based July Pride celebrations going on, I'd like to take you on the audio version of my journey through queer writing, from my own coming out through my stumbling early attempts, to finishing off with some advice I'd like to give to anyone trying to write queer, with the usual caveat that this is my experience and no one else's. So, let's begin. Starting with the personal, coming to terms with my own bisexuality was a longish process, but in hindsight that feels like nothing compared to my journey getting myself to properly representing people in the modern world, where diversity of gender and sexual identity is something that is important to acknowledge. I've still got some way to go, I think, and things have continued to get either better or worse depending where you live. But here's how things started, beginning with my own external experience of queerness. My awareness of lgbtqia+ in media was lacking, to say the least, for a lot of my life. Not because I didn't have exposure or tolerance, I had both within my immediate family, but just because a lot of my awareness came from media. I wasn't much of a going out and interacting with people type for a number of reasons, so I wasn't exposed to that spectrum. I also wasn't being exposed to standard society level homophobia, so you could say I had some advantage in that. I was able to look at something without any early filter of stereotype. I guess it's best to start with my awakening in quotes, even if I didn't become fully aware of my sexuality until the last few years. A lot of people in my social circle have pointed to Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz in 1999's The Mummy as their bisexual awakening. More power to them, but honestly Fraser isn't my type, and when I saw the film I wasn't developed enough in that direction to understand. I now realise in retrospect that my own bi-awakening was with Angelina Jolie and Gerard Butler from the not very good 2001 film Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life. I didn't know why this film was stuck in the recesses of my mind for years until recently. A, the lead's chemistry surrounding their characters' tragic rivalry made up for the many shortfalls in story and script, and B, I found them both physically attractive. So, that's a start. Now, I may be wrong about this, I probably am, but my first remembered exposure to anything explicitly queer within a story was the 1985 film Red Sonja. I voiced my opinions on an aspect of the film, and I don't think it's very good. It's just a bog-standard 1980s fantasy film based on a fantasy tradition that today feels very dated. It's a guilty pleasure film if nothing else, and I might not like it if I saw it now. But Red Sonja was also my first exposure to a lesbian in the form of Queen Gedren. A pretty dodgy example, and one I didn't clock. To me, it just seemed like someone who took people as servants and trophies rather than as unwilling companions. As I said, I wasn't that aware. So we've gone from one porn movie to another, and from standard awakening to yikes representation. I've never kept much of an explicit track of my awareness of lgbtqia+ in fiction, or in real life, until I was well into my 20s. There were a few bits and pieces that surfaced, such as short films which I tended not to like as they were just depressing. Finding lgbtqia+ media that isn't depressing was like finding hen's teeth until relatively recently. And there were some creators coming out with what I found out was called word of gay in quotes, which I've come to look slant-eyed at because, I mean, if you wanted them to be on the spectrum, just say so. Show it in a way that doesn't require you to come out from behind the curtain and address the audience in an "oh, by the way" style. At that point, I discovered video game romances, and exploring them found several queer options. I admit that includes BioWare, as cheesy as they can be, but role-playing these characters gave me a solid sense of what I liked and didn't like. Years later, as a fully awakened bisexual, I played Dragon Age Inquisition and ended up romancing first Cassandra as a man, then Iron Bull, also as a man. I also have to commend both as the most entertaining romances, since they both play in good ways with genre tropes. Cassandra was played as the nervous young woman without losing her badass aspect, while Iron Bull's BDSM relationship is based firmly in reality rather than whatever Fufta Blair Blair does. A few years after that, I'd also run into Yaoi and Bara. It was almost inevitable that I would do that since I enjoyed anime and was interested in stuff beyond the obvious mainstream. For those who don't know yet, yaoi is a Western adopted pejorative term for boys love media that is often written by women and has a reputation for being slightly trashy, while bara is a subset of Japanese manga that is primarily written by lgbtqia+ authors and frequently NSFW. Like, really, really frequently. Like, you would be hard-pressed to find SFW bara of any kind, anywhere. It's there, but you have to look for it. I admit, here and now and openly, that my shelves are a little bare of LGBTQIA+ content, partly because I'm terrible at finding things and need to be selective due to budget, but also because many of the experiences I get recommended are also depressing. It's been the reality for queer people for a long time, particularly the last 2 centuries, that being queer was dangerous or depressing or to live in an oppressed state. But when I read a story, I don't want to be depressed. I want to laugh and be enlightened and see a vision of how the world could be. My own experience with being queer hasn't been depressing and depressed. I've been allowed to mature and experience myself. I now have a full awareness of myself and my sympathies. And while I have occasionally run into homophobia in this wild place called the internet, I've never felt any push to engage, and I've never been directly targeted. I just turned quietly away, blocked, didn't even say goodbye, and walked on, ignoring them completely. That, for me, is the sign of strength for my own queer experience. I also don't feel the need to broadcast my sexuality on a personal level, as I am overall comfortable with who I am. I fully realise that's not a universal experience, but neither is misery. And it's with that strange combination of isolation and personal certainty, and growing frustration with a fictional norm of heartbreak and misery over happy endings, that I truly started putting queer characters into my writing. To say it got off to a rough start would be an understatement. Many of my first attempts at queer characters came from the first extremely long story I wrote, and something that I initially attempted to self-publish. That was The Leviathan Chronicle, a story set within a heavily fictionalized version of the Crusades in a separate world, where 2 opposing supernatural factions, the Seraphim and the Powers, used humans marked by their influence to fight a holy war as a proxy conflict. And out of the 5 lead characters, 3 had some level of queerness relating to their stories and personality. To briefly summarise, the titular character Leviathan was intersex/genderqueer, though using she/her pronouns, and stood as an outsider to the conflict. The other 2 were Elatham, a spy who loses his lover Paimon and is revived after being executed once found out, and Mastema, one of the faction leaders who suffers from trauma due to a certain kind of abuse from his father. I won't go into any more detail. All of them live to the story's end, don't worry, but let's just say I wasn't being very tactful with how certain aspects of their story were handled, excepting Leviathan. It goes without saying, this was my angsty era, and I was working through some stuff in my mind at the time that needed a dark outlet. The 4th lead was Astarte, a woman driven by revenge to the exclusion of all else, but I hardly consider my need to be that dark as an excuse. Basically, because of some elements of my media exposure at the time, many of my stories were and are tragic in tone. Not completely depressing, but still tragic. A different story, which was written as a tragedy from the outset following 8 reincarnated people in a fantastical medieval Europe, had a central subplot where one was reincarnated as twins, with another seeing the surviving twin as her soulmate when he, in this incarnation, is gay. He survives right to the end and isn't persecuted because of his sexuality, but the fact that the female lead isn't able to rekindle this initial incarnation's love for her is the main issue in her story. I don't want to dwell on this longer than is necessary, mostly because I feel queasy knots of embarrassment twisting round me when I think about my early writing, plus this is a story I'll likely never revisit. But it's still worth mentioning because it sums up something I was doing at the time. I wasn't being violent to LGBTQIA+ characters, but I wasn't exactly putting them in happy scenarios. I think you can see through these examples that I was going through a stage of, how do I put this, standard angsty storytelling? War, suffering, religious questioning, the tragedy of reincarnation, all that stuff. That didn't always focus down to specifically queer issues, but I'm sure people will see how queer characters can be magnets for them. It wasn't until my earlier experiences of less problematic relationships in media that my own writing began to change. As I said before, I was a sheltered type, and I was also shy of asking about those subjects with anyone close to me. I also lacked emotional maturity. I hadn't truly known deep emotion, either for real people or fictional characters. I hadn't cried at media in any form. It took that kind of emotional connection for me to think, I want to create something that moves people and even saddens them without falling into the usual traps I'm seeing in popular media. There's enough sadness in the world of people on the spectrum, and while those are valid experiences, I wanted to create experiences that weren't built on heartbreak and abuse, tainted by sorrowful memories. I want experiences that are built on simple love, innocent happiness, the kind of things straight love stories have held on to like vices for decades. Things are changing for the better, especially when you take a step back and look at the broader range of stories outside of the narrow mainstream bubble, but there are still steps to take. And I'd like to live to see a day when both counterculture and mainstream can exist side by side as equals when it comes to queer representation. And so, having gone through my very early stuff and my own internal journey, let's have a look at the stuff that actually made it to print. My debut novel, Starborn Vendetta, is in broad strokes a reimagining of story elements from the Count of Monte Cristo, Faust and Macbeth. But in particular, there was a character who starts off the story and forms a core part of how things progress. That character is Gaspard Atarex, a member of the Fellas people in the cluster who starts off as a guard within prison station Dief, where protagonist Mercedes Solari is sent. Within the first chapter, I wanted to show Gaspard as bitter, hollowed out by his duties, detached from any real passion. He is gay, has a preference for human males, and due to the prison environment has an outlet without needing another person. When Mercedes appears, her magnetic personality awakens a wish to protect her from the vindictive warden, and the only way he can do that is through someone he loathes. The root of that became another character, a Fellas prisoner dubbed Echo. Later in the story, it is revealed that Echo found Gaspard trying to help prisoners, which would have gotten him into huge trouble, and blackmailed him into a relationship. Echo is a predator, plain and simple, and Gaspard is his victim. Things happen, the Dief is exploded, and both Gaspard and Echo survive. Echo tracks down Gaspard and essentially stalks him. At the end of their combined story, Echo is killed by another character. But here's the embarrassing kicker. In the original draft of the story, Gaspard never resolved this core issue and kinda made peace with Echo. I'm getting embarrassed remembering it. I am seeing that this may be interpreted as a form of internalized homophobia. We'll come back to that, but I will say it reflects a passive acceptance of behaviours and ideas of redemption that not only queer media, but media in general has been pushing for decades by this point. The Beauty and the Beast trope taken to one of its logical extremes, the deeply toxic, it's okay, they're fixable, or see, there was good there attitude, which is unacceptable in real life. The odd thing is that when I was writing it, I didn't think of it in terms of them both being men. I wanted a character suffering from that kind of trauma, and either character could easily have been gender swapped. Equally, the fact that Gaspard was gay didn't feel like a factor related to this, just an aspect of how Gaspard was in this world. My editor at the time called this conclusion out immediately, saying that Echo's actions didn't merit any kind of forgiveness. They didn't ask me to do a gender flip, but they did say I needed to show this wasn't a good thing, which I hadn't originally due to how dark my original tone was. I looked through and had to agree with their stance. I'd gone through some more writing by this time and some more media and real life encounters that reshaped my ideas. So rewrites were required. The most basic change I made was that I removed any forgiveness Gaspard originally met out to Echo. Instead, he very actively broke away, and when Echo died, he declares that he hates him and doesn't forgive or forget. Gaspard's emotions are still confused and he's still traumatized, but he's on the path to breaking away from that trauma and finding a life beyond it. I also rewrote some bits to show that Gaspard's emotions towards Echo were extremely confused. influenced by being placed in a vulnerable position and taken advantage of. At his core, he hates Echo, but some part of him believes Echo's statements that he actually desires the connection, in quotes. I did further research into the accounts and treatment of sexual abuse victims during this rewrite. I know I should have done that from the first, and incorporated some of that into his personality and actions. I'd like to think I managed to make him a more nuanced figure in the final draft, which made it to publication. Reading back through this as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, what the hell? And maybe you've got similar reactions. I wrote Starborn Vendetta during a pretty dark period of my life. My maternal grandparents were in the final stages of their lives, my father, unknown to me, was also dying and only had months left, and I was struggling with other things in my family and coming to grips with my own mental health and identity. This included not being embarrassed by my tastes in media, finding my own style of clothing, and asserting myself as an individual within the family without causing undue ruckuses. Prior to the revision, several things happened. First, my father died a few months after I finished writing the initial draft of Starborn Vendetta, which required something of a mental reset for myself. Second, I became more fully aware of how many queer people were actually within my own family, which opened me up to the realization that what I was writing needed to be respectful not just for nebulous others I hadn't yet encountered, but for people within my own family. So going forward, I was. By the time dev edits for Starborn Vendetta came in, I'd already written or part-written the next two entries in the cluster cycle, and it brought me face to face with elements of how I might have ended up writing elements of the next few books. Suffice to say, there was course correction, and that correction was necessary. Since then, I've always been very careful in whether or not to consider incorporating that kind of story, and what I should be researching when portraying it in a respectful and empowering manner. If you'd like more information on the kind of pitfalls I half fell into or nearly fell into, I've linked Emily Inkpen's article Writing Sexual Assault Things to Remember in the description. Now, after all that, and with the air hopefully cleared a little, I think I feel confident enough to give some tips and guidance for writing queer characters. To be clear, this is from my perspective and my experience both in life and in writing. Everyone will have a different bit of advice to offer, and no one way should be taken as gospel. Also, apologies in advance if any of this comes off as inflammatory. Number 1. Don't make gender and orientation the only thing about a character. This is something that could really rub me the wrong way. The thing where some creator, especially mainstream straight, trumpets a character as queer without saying anything else about why they're a compelling character. If the story is a romance, then I think it's a usable exception. But if your character is a detective or a magic user or a scientist, then show that. You know, they're a gay detective, but they're still a detective. Number 2. Keep your representation broad. Again in mainstream, but not in fiction in general, thankfully, there can be a tendency to go either gay or lesbian, treating orientation as a situation of extremes. But there's bi, trans, ace, demi, pan, and the more general queer. There's intersex, which I've always found interesting, and many other variations and classifications beyond the standard human, which everyone, gay or straight, is. Just be broad, reflect reality, and the reality is they're everywhere. It's just the people up top who insist they're not. Number 3. Have more than one queer character. Obviously there are some possible exceptions people will think of, but this is also something that rubs me the wrong way. The token character, the representative to point to and say, yeah, this good now, ook ook. The gay best friend is a trope for a reason, and I dislike it. If you're going to have queer, then have queer. In lots of places. Humanity is a spectrum and a lot more varied than the Western heteronormative, so embrace it. Number 5. Avoid tragedy unless absolutely necessary. Again, a pet peeve of mine, the bury your gays trope. From Maltese Falcon to Copycat to Left Hand of Darkness to Hermaphroditus knows what all. It's thankfully not as common as it once was, but it's deeply rooted in the Hays Code's puritanical obsession with punishing any and all kind of non-standard stuff. Sure, I've admitted to creating tragic or problematic narratives within this episode, and progressive voices have used tragedy to make a point, but nowadays I just find queer characters need much less tragedy. Or none at all, preferably. If you're going for tragedy, just make sure it's doled out equally to straight and queer characters. Get your priorities right. Number 5. Don't let history, in quotes, bully you. This applies to both ethnic and gender diversity, but if you're doing something that is set in a historical time period or history-inspired time period, there can be pressure to make characters white and straight. That's bull, because even a cursory glance at actual historical records will show not only ethnic variety galore, but a spectrum of orientation either inferable or confirmed. Yes, there's reading between the lines involved, and you can go too far the other way, especially if you're touting history to sell a fictional scenario. Looking at you, Mary Villiers from Mary and George. But on the whole, look it up. Do the research. It's very fabulous. Number 6. If you need to have sexy stuff, do it with purpose. You don't need romance and partnerships and relationships and steamy episodes in bed all the time in queer media. Though again, can be genre and tone dependent. I mean, children's literature doesn't need to do it, but it benefits greatly from increased representation. It can be an easy pitfall because of, well, due to pressure from fringe groups who see it as obscene and degenerate, both in quotes, queer content has been tarred with the, quotes, filth brush, and producers of certain media have leaned into that, mainstream and otherwise. But you can be queer and sweet and wholesome. It's completely possible to do that, if you want to. So that's where it concludes for me, for the moment. My third cluster cycle book, The Murderer's Lament, is now in the galley review stage, and I'll hopefully be able to give you a more concrete update soon. Until then, this is Thomas Wrightson saying, to all you fabulous folks, see ya!